Chris Gregg found himself as a junior detective investigating the IRA bombings before starting work on the investigation to catch Peter Sutcliffe, who was dubbed the Yorkshire Ripper. As Gregg made his way up the ranks, he helped to catch some of the UK's most notorious criminals, such as cop killer David Bieber, schoolgirl murderer John Taylor, as well as leading the inquiry into the murders Harold Shipman committed in West Yorkshire. In an exclusive interview, Chris gives us a unique insight into investigating Sutcliffe, as well as catching the so-called Ripper Hoaxer, in a case which spanned his entire career. Hey up, I'm Sophie Maylan, and this is the Mrs. Yorkshire podcast, sponsored by Whitby Seafoods, the home of Scampi. I'm in a sterile interviewing room. You can hear all the echoes due to the lack of furnishings, but this time it's Chris's turn in the hot seat. You've worked with some really high-profile criminals over your career. Can you tell us a bit more about them?
Yeah, it goes back a long way, Sophie.
1974?
1974, and a little bit further back than that, because, as of the time, in 1971, I was a 15-year-old lad who was thinking, right, where is my life going to take me? And I joined the police cadets. I'd be now called a Nepo baby, because my dad was a police sergeant, and so,
Hashtag Nepo baby.
Hashtag Nepo baby. Yeah, so I ended up joining the force because my dad was in and all the rest of it. But I thought, that seems quite an interesting career. He was in the CID, and so my early life was detectives, and they used to have house parties where there were a lot of CID guys there with their wives and girlfriends and things. So I was familiar with that life. And when I joined the cadets, my first taste of major crime investigation was the horrific bombing on the IRA bombing on the M62 in 1973, where I think there were 13 servicemen and their families lost their lives in a coach blast. 16, 17-year-old as a cadet and was drafted in as the T-boy to the incident room. I'd never experienced anything like it. It was being run from an old Victorian police station in Cleckheaton, and it was in winter. This was a major, multi-murder investigation. George Oldfield, who I'd never experienced before at that time, was the lead detective, ably assisted by Detective Superintendent Dick Holland, and they went on to be major parts of the Yorkshire Ripper investigation years later. But that was my first insight, and I was only a kid myself. My job was literally what George Oldfield wanted, he got. I was sent out to the shops or on errands, making the tea, but I was in the heart of a major investigation, a terrorist investigation at that point, where the whole focus was to find out who'd done it. And the sombre seriousness of that environment has never left me, because I've never felt anything as scary in terms of the atmosphere. This was really serious stuff. And the detectives all to me looked like my dad, and I felt out of place in a way, that be seen and not heard, like just a fly on the wall, witnessing what happened for 3 months. And it was a taste of something that in my career as I went on, I was going to experience in different roles and ranks, obviously, but that was my first insight into it. And so from a very early age as a kid, I was seeing what was happening in the world of major crime investigation from, right in the heart of it.
And how did you make your way up those ladders?
It was a journey that you have to learn your craft, I suppose, in every profession. I started on the first run as a young constable in uniform, and then I always had aspirations to be a detective, probably because of my dad's background and everything, I'd see. And I did my time on the beat, and then was looking towards CID. And at that time, I was living in Huddersfield, which is my hometown. And in 1978-ish, was applying to be a detective, and you had to go through your training and do your exams and everything else. Very, very different to today, because at that time it was seen as a very almost prestigious passage to be entering into the CID, the world of CID, and there were lots of hurdles to overcome to get in there. Even down to the point of when you'd done your 6 months training, you'd done all your exams, you'd been on your 3 or 4 months course to learn all the criminal law aspects of it. You then had the final step of being interviewed by 2 very senior detectives, and I remember one of mine was Dick Holland again, coming across Dick Holland. He was one of them, and they didn't suffer fools, these guys at the time. And having the experience of sitting in front of them, in a low chair, and they were in the high chairs behind the desk, a couple of, gnarly detective superintendents, and being interviewed for half an hour, and you either had the thumbs up or the thumbs down, and your career depended on that. And anyway, fortunately, I got the thumbs up, and off I went to start my career as a detective constable at Huddersfield CID. I'd only been a detective a few months when the Yorkshire Ripper investigation was underway in force. There was a murder in Huddersfield, and Helen Ripker was murdered in the Hill House area. A major investigation was launched, and the whole team moved into town to investigate it, led by George Oldfield. I was called into the incident room to do a job in the incident room on that murder investigation. I'm seeing at first hand now the mechanics of how the investigation was administrated, because I was part of the old manual system of documenting, raising actions, indexing, with a team of people, like-minded people around, and all the calls were coming in and all the intelligence was coming in. There were a few interesting things happened there that stick in my mind. One was Helen Ripker, the girl who was killed, her sister Rita, they were twins. Yeah. I think they were only 18 or 19. I remember George Oldfield, who's had obviously a lot of bad press through the Yorkshire investigation subsequently, but the murder of Helen was the 7th murder. Turned out to be the 8th, actually. We thought it was the 7th, but Yvonne Pearson's body hadn't been found by that time. She'd been killed before Helen Ripker, but her body wasn't found until afterwards. So we thought Helen was the 7th victim. One afternoon, we were told that Mr. Oldfield was going to bring in Helen's sister Rita to see what was happening in the incident room. I was in with the staff. There were maybe about 15 staff around a big table in the incident room with a big metal wheel with all the index cards on. The whole room was filled with maps and plans and timelines of events. And we were told he was going to bring Rita Ripker in to see. And when George Oldfield brought her in, the atmosphere in the room, you could just cut with a knife, because he was very, very empathetic with her. And I didn't realise at the time why. And he was so caring with her and gentle as he showed her around the room. Didn't introduce people, he was just showing her around the timeline, taking around the charts on the wall, explaining, where Helen had been last seen. These are the 15-minute blocks of time, what we're going to try and explain to her and give her confidence in a way that we're trying to do our best here, piece this together. I felt he was very, very caring with her, because this was with a day or two of losing her sister. Afterwards, I learned that he'd lost his own daughter. I think he'd lost a daughter, and she was about 15 or 16. And it just made sense to me. I thought, I see that.
That lived experience.
Yeah, I thought, I get this, it all made sense. One of the other things that happened during that time in the incident room was when the first of the Yorkshire Ripper Hoaxer letters came in. And I was one of the team again round the table, but this letter was in an exhibits bag, so we thought, interesting, because letters were coming in all the time, documents, information. I remember reading this through the plastic bag, and a lot of it didn't make sense to me at the time, because it was saying, like, don't forget Preston 75, which to me meant nothing at that time.
Yeah.
But was obviously part of the plan of the person who sent the letter to try and inspire belief that these were genuine. And it all unravel later. But that was something that stuck in my mind about being aware of what is this letter? Why is it in a plastic bag?
Yeah.
It was obviously being taken more seriously than others. But didn't think too much of it at that time. But it was an interesting time. That was the first of... I worked after the incident room. As a young detective, I worked on the investigation team, and I was transferred onto the investigation team and worked on the next 3 murder investigations, which was Josephine Whittaker, Barbara Leach and Jacqueline Hill. So I was on the detective directed inquiry teams, where I was going out and doing all the things that detectives would do on murder investigations such as this, which was taking statements, questioning suspects.
What was it like dealing with the pressure though? Because obviously, I know you've dealt with the likes of David Bieber and different notorious criminals, but when you're dealing with somebody like the Ripper Hoaxer, such a well-known case, was there a lot of external pressure on you to perform in that situation?
As a young detective on a murder investigation, you have the pressure of doing the action that you are required to do. And policing has to be, if it's done properly, a disciplined organisation with standards, working protocols, working to systems and processes. That's how it functions. And there is pressure on you to make sure that you are doing your job properly. For example, as a BERT, the higher you go up through the ranks, there are different pressures on you. The person who has, obviously for obvious reasons, the most responsibility is the person who's leading it. And, investigations will stand or fall on the decisions you make. And people can lose their lives. If you've got a killer that is still at large, other lives can be lost. But if you're a detective constable, you have huge pressure on you, because you are required to go and knock on the door and take statements, and potentially be the person who is, first of all, coming face to face with that suspect. And taking the Ripper case as an example, he was questioned 9 times during the course of that investigation. There were pairs of detectives who interviewed him, so there were 18 detectives who would have come face to face with Peter Sutcliffe before he was caught. Unfortunately, none of them had they didn't have the full deck of cards, but they had some cards. And I think on a couple of occasions he should have come at me in handcuffs, and he didn't. And other people lost their lives subsequently. Now that puts pressure on, because I know that the senior detectives who were leading it, the George Oldfields, the Jim Hobsons, the Dick Hollands, they were all leading it at various parts. They had set the investigation traps and processes to get the killer into the net. The killer was in the net several times. That net had a big hole in it, because the investigation was relying on people like me at my rank to go and knock on the door. Me and my colleagues were sent out to question that person, and didn't recognise that the killer was in front of us. And so, yes, there is pressure on you. And at that time, it isn't quite the same now, but you had to write your final report. If I was tasked with questioning somebody, you had to write off either saying, I'm satisfied this person is not involved. Or, if not, if you couldn't satisfy, you had to really go and satisfy the powers that be, that there was good reason for that and that extra work was needed. Now, I did that on a couple of occasions, but it was very hard to make that happen if the bosses at the time were not wanting to expend resources on it. And so you had to make your case. And so, yes, there are pressures on you, but with the Ripper, I felt, when the case was eventually solved and Peter Sutcliffe was arrested, West Yorkshire Police, the stigma of the force hanging over it lasted for many years because of the failings, and rightly so. There were some big mistakes made, not deliberately, obviously. It was the people who were in charge of it were doing their best to try and catch him, and I saw it firsthand. There was not, you could not say there was any lack of effort there. There was all sorts of breakdowns, system breakdowns, people breakdowns, decisions made that wouldn't be made in hindsight. There were some catastrophic decisions made, which cost people their lives, I think, ultimately.
What was particularly frustrating for you as a young detective?
Well, at the time, there was a lot of emphasis being placed on the authenticity of the letters, the tapes, which turned out to be a hoax. I can see why they were taken seriously, but I do think, and I am talking in hindsight now, that if this were happening today, what would have happened would have been that the investigation would have continued on the direction it was, and the investigation to identify the author of the letters would have been kept separately.
Yeah.
Because they should have been
two in tandem.
They should have been two in tandem, but running separately. When the letter came in, the first one that mentioned about don't forget Preston 75, that was relating to a lady called Joan Harrison who was murdered in Preston in 1975. And it was almost like the teaser that the author of the letter was sending to say, hey, I know what I'm talking about here. You should take me seriously because I've killed somebody else. And that lady was murdered and battered to death. There were certain situational things that happened that, as it turned out to be, were coincidences. Whereas, until it was known there were coincidences, it could be and was taken that it could be the same killer. And one, for example, was that Joan Harrison had been bitten by the killer, and the killer had a gap between his teeth. And there was semen as well, and that was shown to, this was pre-DNA, was shown to be a B, someone with a B secretor, so a B blood group, which was only 6% of the population. Josephine Whittaker was bitten when she was being killed, and the killer had a 1/8 gap between the teeth. When the letters came in, the saliva on the envelopes was shown to be a B secretor. And when Irene Richardson was murdered in Leeds, one of the earlier victims, the killer had placed her boots on the back of her legs in like a ritualistic kind of fashion, with the feet turning outwards and a coat over her. And Joan Harrison had a boot placed between her legs and her coat was laid over. So these were the reasons that those leading the hunt for the killer of the Yorkshire victims were thinking this could be connected. And because it had been mentioned in the letter, one of the letters, they started taking it seriously. After Sutcliffe was sentenced for 13 murders and 7 attempt murders, the thoughts about who'd sent these hoax letters was almost resigned to history. It was not being pursued. But it never left me, in a way, and I think it was, having been in that incident room, going on through my career now, through the detective ranks, seeing the catastrophe that the person who had sent those letters had caused, probably unwittingly, because they perhaps didn't intend them, or didn't expect them to be taken as serious as they were. And 3 women lost their lives after that. Would they have been saved? Who knows? But what the person who involved themselves in sending those letters did was it resulted in a lot of resources being distracted from the inquiry. It resulted in too much emphasis being placed on Geordie accent and so on and so forth. Would he have been caught beforehand? Who knows? But it certainly didn't help. And I remember talking to a couple of heads of CID at the time to say, look, those Ripper letters and the tape surely, it can't be beyond the wit of man now if we can get them tested, the back of the stamps, and the saliva and the seals, that we might be able to get a match here. We've got DNA now.
Yeah.
Come on.
Yeah.
I didn't get anywhere with that because it was, we've got things happening today that we need to dealing with, which, we can't argue with that. But I just thought this would be a quick thing, if we send the letters, send the envelopes off for testing. It just seemed so straightforward. It was a case of, well, we don't even know where the letters are. It was, and there have been reviews done in the past, which I obviously wasn't aware of, but they'd had reviews to find these letters and do this. Anyway, I eventually ended up in the position where I didn't have to ask anybody here. I was now head of CID, in charge of the most senior rank in the force at the time. Something had been in, I think, the Sunday People only a few weeks earlier, which I'd seen, which was a bad headline, which was saying, useless cops in Yorkshire have lost the letters or something. I thought, where on earth did this come from? 25 years afterwards, this is still being levelled at the force, so we've got to put this to bed once and for all. And I've got to sort this out, or if we can't sort it out, it won't be for the lack of trying. And we had a lot happening in the force at the time. We had an awful lot happening. We'd got the aftermath of the 7/7 bombings that happened in London on the underground, which all the terrorists were here in Yorkshire on our patch.
Yeah.
We were working with the Met on that. But freedom of information was coming in. It was on the 1st of January 2005. And I was also aware that we needed to have all our ducks in a row for all the big cases. I was conscious that a lot of the material was still spread all over the force because the murders had happened in all the different towns and cities. And so I quietly just tasked a couple of detectives to start pulling together a couple of objectives. The first one was collate all the information electronically. And secondly was locate where the letters and get the provenance of what's happened to the letters and the tapes. And they peddled away at that in the month. They were on the cold case team we had, and they peddled away doing that. And all the information and documentation and whatever was left was archived in our major crime store electronically, so it can all be searchable.
How long did all that take?
It took a few months, but they weren't just doing that. They were doing all sorts, and this was like a part of their overall work that they were doing. And they were keeping me updated as they were going, and they were saying, right, we're going down to London to see the scientists who were doing the fingerprint examination of the letters. They couldn't find the letters, the detectives, anywhere in the stores, and they'd been up to the local laboratory at Wetherby, for example, which covered our area and force area. And the forensic science laboratory at Wetherby had a drawer that was marked Ripper, letters and tape, which you would think, okay, open the drawer, empty, as it would be, not there. So that was the starting point. But the journey then took them on. They did a really good job because they just followed the trail of where these things had been sent. So they came back and said, look, we've spoken to the scientist, the fingerprint expert, there were two of them who did the work. And they were tasked with trying to lift fingerprints from the paper of the letters and the envelopes. They used a chemical called ninhydrin, which is still used today. But ninhydrin turns paper purple when they put the chemical on to lift the fingerprints out. And the two detectives said, the scientists were that determined. There were no fingerprints on any of the letter pages or the envelope. And they said that they were that determined that it didn't just turn it purple. They put that much ninhydrin, after ninhydrin on it, turned them black, and they had for health and safety, even in those days, and this was in the late 70s, early 80s, they had to fumigate the London laboratory for all the health and safety reasons after using all this chemical.
Wow.
And the letters were destroyed. So we found that the letters no longer existed. All there were pristine photographs of them that had been taken. You have to just make sure that, nobody's just kept a snippet of something, because I'm aware, and scientists, in my experience, depending who the scientist is, not all of them, but depending who the scientist is, and I've known that at times, if there has been, for example, a blood-stained garment, that the scientists keep a little bit often, because they don't know what's around the corner with forensic developments. We thought we won't just ask the laboratory, because if you ask, you can just be told back verbally. Let's put it in writing. So we put it in writing to the laboratory, saying, can you please confirm that you have got no items or remnants of any of the letters, blah, 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 from the letters or the tape? And weeks, if not a couple of months, went by, and we heard nothing. And suddenly, out of the blue, we got a call to say, we have found Peter Graham too, who I knew very well. Peter was the head of the major crime unit in the laboratory. And Peter said that Valerie Tomlinson, who was a biologist, fantastic biologist, and if there was anybody who'd want doing it, it would be Valerie looking for us. And Valerie found in a place in the laboratory where it shouldn't have been a glass slide. Well, there were two glass slides, and in between the two glass slides was a 3 centimetre piece of the seal of envelope number 2, and it was perfectly preserved.
Wow.
And she blew the dust off the slide, because it had been there for 25 years or 30 years, and it was there perfectly preserved. So we now had something tangible to examine. So the hard work in some ways had been done finding that, and by finding that, it unlocked now the whole case, because with a perfectly preserved 3 centimetre piece of a seal that had been cut out from the scientists before sending it down to London for fingerprint testing the envelope. They just had the forward thinking to think, we might not have the means today in 1980
oh, wow.
or 81.
So they'd had that
They'd had
possibility.
The forward thinking, which some of them did, and we knew that, scientists tended to do that. And once we'd found it, and thank God we did find it, then that just unlocked the whole thing, because it was quickly examined, and it came back with a 1 in a billion match on a chap called John Humble. When Peter rang me and said, Chris, you're not going to believe it, we've got a match on this guy. My first words to him were, when he rang, because he was in Wetherby, I might have been in Wakefield in a meeting at the time. I said, where's he from? Because if he was from Sunderland, which is where the accent had been proved to be from the Castletown area of Sunderland, from the experts who analysed the tape phonetics. And I said, where's he from? And he said, he's from Sunderland. I said, who is he? He said, there's a guy called John Humble. He said he's only been on the database a few years, he was doing some petty crime a few years ago. And that was the breakthrough. So within hours now, I sent a team up to the northeast, and we brought him back down to Wakefield. But he was completely paralytic. He was a serious alcoholic. It took him 2 days to sober up. We couldn't question him for 2 days.
Wow.
And so that was the start then of unlocking and unpicking, why had done this, and who was this character? And so it all unfolded from that point, that it was a moment in my career, in my life really, where, that case and investigation had played such a big part in my early career.
Yeah.
And I was now coming towards the end of my career. So I almost started and finished with that case, because digging him out at that stage, I knew he wouldn't ever been identified, because shortly after this, and I left the force, within a couple of years. I think I was probably the last person in the force when I left that had worked as a detective on the Sutcliffe cases. But so I know that there was nobody else around who was invested in finding out who'd sent the hoax letters. But shortly after that, the laboratories at Wetherby and across the country, that they were Home Office run, they were all disbanded.
Oh, wow.
So the items, they'd have all been just sent to major stores and centralised archives. So I think the chances of ever finding who sent those tapes would have been lost forever. So,
and did you question Humble, or did you have to direct other detectives?
I didn't question him personally, but it was a detective sergeant, Stuart Smith, and his colleague Roger Horner. And so the plan had been, I think, for say 5 interviews with the suspect were planned out. First one's a fairly gentle underarm, bowling action at them, just to try and get them ease, get them talking without declaring all you hand at that point. And it was a little bit like that, so it was following usual kind of process. But I was live monitoring it from a room near to the interview rooms. Ahead of that, and again, aware of, you do not want to lose any evidence if the person is confessing, for example, because you don't want to be having the evidence deemed inadmissible because you've done something wrong. Talk about belt and braces, I knew everything that we could get wrong if we weren't careful. So John Humble, we didn't know what mental health issues he had, so we had to make sure we had him psychiatrically assessed. We needed to make sure that he was fit for interview. When he was interviewed, we needed to make sure if someone challenged his mental state or his IQ or anything like that, we didn't want to be deemed we'd done something wrong, so we made sure that he had an appropriate adult there from social services. He had his lawyer there. There were several people in the interview room at the same time, plus the detectives. It was one of the most fascinating interviews, really, because I've never known anybody in interview react like John Humble. We often are faced with no comment or no reply, but usually the suspect would say to the detectives, no comment. The question would be asked, they'd say, no comment. But John Humble was different. The detectives asked him a question, and he would answer by shaking his head as a no or nodding as a yes. So he wasn't speaking. So as soon as we saw this, we thought, right, he's not wanting us to hear his voice for analysis.
Okay.
So he wasn't speaking, and because what I was, and the team were conscious of was that, okay, we've got the person who licked the envelope, which we knew was 1 in a billion DNA, but have we got the author of the letters? Because he perhaps could have said, well, I licked the envelopes, but I wasn't the author, I just was asked to lick them for a mate. I just asked to post them for a mate. So we knew, you have to think of all what could be said to counter it. So in our interview plan, we had first interview is the low bowler, the underarm, the gentle opener. But then, I think third interview down, we planned to drop the DNA into it. So we wanted to give him the rope in a way and to have his explanation. He knew why he'd been arrested, but he didn't know the evidence we had. After the first interview, we thought, it's got to be him. There's no reason why he doesn't want us to hear his voice, because he knew it would be the giveaway. But we have to disclose to the solicitor what the content of the interview is going to be. So, in the break between the interview went on for about half an hour. It was a fairly short interview, the first one. But had a word with the detectives and said, look, drop the DNA. There's no point at the moment, wasting time in the second interview. Drop the DNA on the next interview. But part of the plan for the whole interview process was that we wanted, if he was talking, to ask him to read out the transcript of the tape that was sent, the I'm Jack tape, the notorious I'm Jack, your boys are letting you down, George. And we wanted that because we thought that even if we was admitting it or denying it, we could get the tape analysed so that we had evidence then that it was the same voice from the original one. So after the first interview, when he was doing his nodding and shaking, we then said, right, reconvene, put the DNA on his tools. And they mentioned about the DNA. He immediately started to speak. And his solicitor tried to stop him speaking. You know, you don't know, and he just said, no, I want to tell them. And it was the key to unlocking the door. And it was as though for 25, 30 years he'd had this pent up inside him, and it all came out. It just all came out, exactly what he'd done. It was one of those moments, just watching him on the tape when he started for the very first time saying what he'd done and what had happened. It was one of the most surreal experiences in a way, because just thinking back about the whole journey to get to this point with this guy and thinking, yeah, this is the person now that we're looking at, caused and resulted in the damage and the carnage and catastrophe and everything that had happened. And here he is now, this almost pitiful character.
Did he have any remorse or any...
I don't know. I think he knew the game was up.
It was more of an acceptance.
It was more of an acceptance. He couldn't really explain why he'd done it. One of the interesting things was that he mentioned that he had rung the police about 6 months after, when it was all over the national news, the handwriting, the tape, the focus was on the northeast now. And he said, I rang the police and told them that it was a fake. And we knew that actually was right. We asked him then to read out a transcript of the I'm Jack tape where he sent the tape in, and the one that was played by George Oldfield, to the public to ask if anyone had heard this voice. And when he started reading the transcript out, it was as though he'd been transported back in time to when he made that tape, because he did read it out, but he read it out in exactly the same tone, the same expressiveness with it, and the same emphasis on the key words. And it was literally a hair standing up moment on the back of my neck listening to this guy, because I was part of the investigation team when George Oldfield played it to us the day before he released it publicly. This was just after Josephine Whittaker had been murdered in Halifax in 1979, mid-79. And he played us this tape and said, I want you to listen very carefully to this, because this is what we believe the voice of the killer. And I want you to listen to see if you've interviewed or questioned anybody with this voice. And there was 200 detectives in this room. And when he switched click and it played that voice, and you could have, the word pin drop doesn't even go anywhere near to the silence that was, you could have heard grass growing, it was that quiet, apart from this voice, because everybody was straining every muscle to listen to this, and I was listening to it intently, thinking about questioning anybody, the voice, and he played it 2 or 3 times. And I was transported back into that room listening to John Humble reading that transcript and thinking, I can't believe, because I could not get that voice out of my head at the time. I was going home thinking about, have I questioned somebody? And everybody we were then questioning, was it this one? So it had a big impact. And after we'd interviewed him and he was charged, I had a conversation with Dick Holland, who'd been a key senior detective on the case with George Oldfield, and told him we'd got this guy and charged him, and he was asking about who he was and what his background was, and he was explaining all that. This wasn't any master criminal kind of thing, this was just a pitiful character from Sunderland. There was a lot of things wrapped up as the Ripper Hoaxer cases. And yes, dealt with some horrific people and crimes in my career, but the John Humble case and that Hoaxer case, wrapping that up and solving that was a really important.
And I guess it's almost full circle for you from that moment.
It was full circle from start to finish, and it came, at that point, it was very much towards the end of my career, but it was full circle, but it was something that was I felt critically important just for finding that missing piece of that jigsaw.
Yeah. Because
of the impact and everything that had happened, it was an important piece of work to do.
Thank you so much, Christopher Gregg.
You can find out more about Chris Gregg's incredible career, where he worked on some of the region's most high-profile investigations, only on the yorkshirepost.co.uk. You can watch more by heading to the Yorkshire Post Daily Motion and searching for the Mrs. Yorkshire podcast. We'll be back next week where we meet some of Yorkshire's most famous faces in their favourite places. Thanks so much for listening. See you soon.